The following interview took place September 3rd, 2015. The conversation was between myself and Counter Apologist on the topic of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. We are now tuning in for the rest of the broadcast to that interview. Please enjoy. This is Maximus Confesses here. Welcome, viewers. Joining me is a special guest, the Counter Apologist. For today's show, I wanted to interview someone who's on the opposite side of the fence, on the Kalam. For those of you who don't know, Counter-Apologetics is the art of refuting apologetical arguments for God's existence and for Christianity. The reason I want to approach the topic this way is because it avoids an echo chamber and allows us apologists to separate bad arguments and bad formulations of arguments from good arguments. Here we're going to go into detail of the various supports and refutations for the Kalam, but first let me introduce the Counter-Apologist, who has the best series refuting the Kalam I have yet to find on YouTube. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Now, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, considering the Kalam was the first series you did here on YouTube, do you have kind of a special affinity for it, or is it just going to be because it happens to be the best argument or the most popular argument on the internet at the time?
No. I'm an apostate. I deconverted from Christianity, and I tried to go back. And when I went back, I was like kind of the first time I really ever did look at apologetics from even a Christian perspective. Mm-hmm. And it was I'm an engineer by training, so I've taken a decent amount of physics. I have a fairly high respect for science, and the Kalam struck at me because it was one of these arguments that says science kind of points to God rather than counting against it. And that really intrigued me as I was trying to convince myself to go back to Christianity because my family believed. And the more I researched it, the more wrong I found it. I guess that's probably phrase that better. And so it was one of those, like, I felt it to be fairly dishonest. Not that I think apologists who use it are liars. It's just more that it tends to be presented in a very deductive way, a very formulaic, science truly does point to God, when in actuality the case is far more complicated, and I think on balance it actually proves to be a pretty good argument against the existence of God.
Interesting. So one of the first things I wanted to detail was the scientific aspect, but isn't there also kind of a big mathematical component? Because a lot of apologists who use or utilize this argument kind of point to the impossibility of mathematics showing out an infinity without it kind of resulting in some kind of logical contradiction or something problematic, metaphysically speaking, when it kind of emerges within our universe.
Well, I don't think that there's anything... I really don't think that the math comes into play all that well. I mean, you'll see, generally Craig or somebody will try and just say that, the impossibility of an actual infinite or reaching an infinite by successive addition. And there are certainly responses to that, especially from a mathematical point of view, that, as far as I'm aware, Craig has not answered in formal literature. But in general, the way I've approached that is to say there's absolutely nothing logically contradictory about an actual infinite. I mean, Cantorian set theory is fairly well established. The ZFC axioms, which is basically the basic set of axioms that is used by almost all Western mathematicians anyway. I don't know about other kinds. And that includes the axiom of infinity. And so there's no basically the kinds of paradoxes that you'll see Craig or others bring up, like Hilbert's Hotel, can be resolved if you properly define what kind of infinity is being talked about and the way the scenario is actually played. There's no formal contradiction, and the most that Craig can say is that he finds it to be metaphysically impossible. But for a philosopher to say that something is metaphysically impossible is them to just make a subjective call about what they think is metaphysically impossible. There's no way to really show that this is some kind of a truly impossible thing.
I see. So now one of the first things I wanted to get to was maybe now we could go on to the more scientific elements, because I think the math has been talked about. Although I guess I should touch on one thing that it is kind of boggling on my mind. When it comes to the universe and playing by whichever rules of math there are, can it be established that the universe does abide by Cantorian set theory, or as opposed to some other kind of mathematical model? Because from what I'm aware, math is like a set of rules. But if the universe isn't playing by those rules, how can we apply and say it's possible that it is indeed an infinite, at least under the standards set down by Counterian set theory?
Well, so that's a pretty interesting point. So the way that I kind of look at it, and I'm by no means a true expert in this, is that we kind of look at the way I like to think of it is math is kind of like the map, and reality is the terrain.
Right.
And the thing that works about math, and actually I think more generally about metaphysics, is that it's really just a set of axioms that you start off with, right? There's no, you can't go beyond those. You're just like, this is, if you start with the law of identity, you'll get, 1 + 1 = 2, and you could derive those sorts of things. And there's certain things that we can't derive or whatever. But we do take, say, ZFC, Zeno-Franco plus choice, I think is how you call it. And we start with those, and we derive all these. With those axioms, you could derive all of the wonderful little equations that we use in physics. And the way we think that we say these axioms are probably true is because the equations that we can derive from them work. Right? So as we say, you basically will derive the set of equations, and you say this equation maps to the behavior of, say, velocity and acceleration or whatever. It's a differential equation or something. And hey, it seems to work. And that the fact that it works and that it gives us a fairly accurate map makes us think that those axioms that we use to derive the equation are probably true.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of like a point of falsification. If the universe acts as if it does behave by the rules of Counterian set theory, then that's just something we would have to take into account, tentatively at the very least, up until the time it's in point falsified. So it would work very similar to a scientific model.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, that's the way I tend to think of it. And so you would just basically say, if we're going to assume it as an axiom until we are given reason, because it seems to work. Mm-hmm. And if something better comes along that has more explanatory power, like the shift from Newtonian to Einsteinian mechanics or something like that, if that was to happen in math, maybe with a new set of axioms, then we would discard ZFC and go to whatever the new thing was.
Right. Now, at this point, the term ZFC has been thrown around, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be very hard to describe it without getting bogged down in a lot of theoretical math. So for the viewers who are listening at this point, I'm going to send a link in the description bar below detailing ZFC in a very simple and easy to follow fashion. If anyone likes, they could click that link, come back, rewatch the part you might have missed out on, and you can hopefully enjoy the rest of the show, or you could just skip over all the math stuff and just go on to the other parts of the discussion, which at this point is going to be the universe's beginning as it is presented by science. In your first video, CA, you kind of detailed that when the universe kind of begins to exist in a physics sense, it's very different than we might colloquially expect it in terms of, let's say, me constructing the Statue of David. I think that was the example you gave. With the Statue of David, when all the things are just configured properly, bam, that's the statue. However, when the universe comes into being, that's really a bit different than the other one. Can you kind of detail what scientists mean when they detail the universe coming into being from the point of a singularity?
Okay, so there's a few things there. So I guess the point about the Statue of David is when I was making my video series, it's a bunch of years ago at this point, there was a more classic formulation that Craig used for the argument, and so Craig was using a bit more of an Aristotelian style, at least talking about things like efficient causes and material causes, and so he would normally do that in some of his literature. He's since revised things a little bit and changed a thing of the formulation of the argument. But basically, the thing is that when we were to think about something having a cause in our general experience, we would think about things having a material cause, which is the material that something is made out of. So the material cause of a Statue of David would be a slab of marble. And the efficient cause, which is really what Craig is after, is the thing that the agent that caused it to happen, or the mechanism that caused the statue to come about, which in this case would be the artist Michelangelo. Now, when we get into physics, to say that the universe came from a singularity is itself, science doesn't really say that. I know that's how it's typically presented, but most working physicists today do not believe a singularity exists. And there's a bit we could talk more about that if you like. But so what we talk about in terms of a beginning of the universe, and sometimes that might not even be the right word to use, is that we think that in terms of time and space-time, so there's these things called world lines if you look at general relativity as a theory, and we start tracing them back using general relativity and the Big Bang model. We trace things back, and we see the universe forms back into this very dense, hot state. And in that hot state, according to the classic formulation of general relativity, all world lines, which includes basically all pieces of time, converge into this thing, and then we hit what the singularity is the equations break down. Basically, all your numbers go to infinity, and the theory no longer applies. It can't describe what's actually going on in reality. And so that is taken by apologists to be a beginning, a thing to say that this is where time began, so to speak. And that is one way of looking at it. There are a number of different ways that most physicists cash out the beginning, and then there's a lot more to actually say about what happens when general relativity gets to that point. But I think I might have over-answered your question a little bit there.
No. I think that's fantastic because you said it was kind of one way of looking at it, and to hone it in, the way I've always kind of seen it, coming from my own viewpoint of seeing time and space, which is a bit different than Craig does, is that space and time are both properties of the universe. They're something that are just built into the very foundation. When it comes to time, I kind of see it now. I'm pretty sure since this is audio only, the audience isn't going to see it, but I have a glass in front of me, and on one side you have kind of like an edge where the glass begins to exist or starts, where the rest of it is just air, and from there it kind of expands up to the very top of the glass. I'm holding it sideways here. Now, I kind of imagine the universe to begin in this kind of sense, where it's kind of like space and time's boundaries. And as it continues to go onward, there are events taking place. Could one cash out beginning in this kind of sense through analogy? Would that be fairly accurate?
You most certainly can, but I don't think that helps. And as a matter of fact, Craig would object very strongly to that kind of a view of it, because that would imply a different theory of time. And once you talk about the Kalam, you really can't escape talking about how one views time, and there's a bunch of metaphysical assumptions that go there. Right. But so you could certainly say you're describing something like a shuttlecock, or the thing that's used in badminton. And so the universe kind of looks like that. You'd see this picture in science textbooks. And so so there's lots of different ways to view time. And the ironic thing is that the Kalam is not compatible with all views of time, but theism, and probably Christian theism, is compatible with them. And so there's basically three ways to cash time out. There's what Craig prefers, which is the A theory of time, which is basically time is a series of present moments. And then there is the B theory of time, which thinks that there is a space-time four-dimensional manifold that is our universe as we normally classically envision it. And then the third option, which is a bit controversial, is that time is not fundamental. Time is an emergent property, kind of like temperature, and that there just is this stuff that makes up things that we can model in terms of a four-dimensional space-time, but doesn't actually describe reality as it is. And this is not actually some vast atheist conspiracy. There's a evangelical Christian physicist known as Don Page, who's done some wonderful work in terms of quantum mechanics, and he actually has an interview with internet apologist Randall Rouser on his webpage, where he talks about how he himself is actually skeptical of the fact that time exists.
This is called the non-real approach to time.
Yeah, it's a non-realist approach.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny because if you read the book The Confessions by St. Augustine, chapter 11, he kind of touches on a very similar theory. There's kind of like a point in time where I'm currently experiencing it. There's also a future, which is my experience plus anticipation for something. And then again, there's me and kind of memories of the past. Whereas for God, he doesn't see time the same way. He sees it all going on in one singular event, which I always found to be kind of the more hand in hand view of time and Christianity myself, but that's just me.
So there's the problem that Craig will have with that view is that um, he wants a creation ex nihilo, and this is where I think you can kind of turn the Kalam on its head.
Mhm.
And so the issue is that Craig, the Kalam itself wants to make an issue of the fact that theoretically, at least from a colloquial standpoint, time as we know it had a beginning, right?
Right.
There's different ways to look at it where that's not necessarily the case, but let's just go with what Craig, the man on the street view, is that you would say time had a beginning according at least to the Big Bang. And so the fact that our universe is finitely old instead of infinitely old, he thinks he can leverage into some premises that would point to a God. But I actually kind of want to, and to do that, he has a very specific view of physical time, right? The physical time is the beginning of the universe, began at the Big Bang, and it's progressed on for 13-something billion years. And the problem is that he kind of lands himself back into hot water because the view he takes is that God is atemporal. He exists outside of time before he created the universe. And so when God created the universe, he created time and so became temporal because now there is this temporal thing that God is interacting with. And so the issue is that if God wanted to create a universe, right, then how is the universe not as old as God, right? Why isn't the universe infinitely old? You have to have some state of affairs in which there is only God and no universe. But if that's the case, then only God would have been around for, God has to then kind of sit and wait, right? There's no way for God to just, he's just there, and then all of a sudden he's like, meh, universe, right? Boom, here it goes.
Yeah.
Except to go from one state to the other requires a time, and the fact that it's finite means that there must have been some kind of a waiting period, right? There's no way. So there's some kind of a God time, or what Craig has called in the past a metaphysical time, which he thinks is a God sequence of mental events, or at least a way that I've read him describe it. And that might not be in terms of prior to creation of the universe. But the fact that the universe exists in a finite amount of time but was created by God is just as much a problem for the Christian theist, I think, as it would be for an atheist.
I would actually agree with you. Personally, I find that Craig's viewpoint on God's relationship to time to be, from a theological standpoint, at the very least, very heterodox. For most of Christian history, God has been atemporal and continues to be atemporal even now as we speak, whereas creatures living in time are finite. They are things which are temporal, which have these kind of mental experiences and sequences, and that's always kind of been the relationship. In terms of scientific realism and anti-realism, these are kinds of two views in the philosophy of science. One holds that we're kind of committed to the knowledge, or at least the metaphysical assumptions and discoveries that science makes in their models. And anti-realism more or less states that a lot of unobservable things are really just things to help us out in experiments, measurements, things of that nature. Now, it's not just like a pure dichotomy. You could be an anti-realist in some fields and a realist in other fields. You can take it on a case-by-case basis. There's really not just one clear-cut answer. But I'm actually kind of curious about something. Couldn't one dismiss the universe beginning to exist in the second premise just by taking up, in theoretical physics at the very least, an instrumentalist take where the singularity is just, and I know you said that singularities aren't really held to anymore, but if there was such a thing, or some kind of equivalent in science nowadays, couldn't one just take the notion that this is just where our equations break down, our instruments are of no use anymore? There is no telling whether or not there is a beginning, so we could kind of remain agnostic.
Yeah, so that's one of the that's one of the points, at least I think I made in my video, is so basically the way that this is what the Big Bang actually means. If you're going to talk to a theoretical physicist or any kind of a working physicist right now, what they're going to tell you, if they're going to be fairly uh, representative in what the actual state of affairs is that basically physics works to a certain scale. So if you were to take a college level, freshman level physics 1, you're going to basically learn Newtonian mechanics, right? You're going to learn equations like force equals mass times acceleration. The acceleration is the first derivative of velocity, and there's all sorts of different kinds of equations that you'll learn. And then you'll progress on. And then eventually when you get to graduate school, if you were to continue on the line of physics, you're going to learn that's all kind of wrong.
Right? No, right. In fact, I had a friend who was, before going into religious studies, she was a chemistry major, and she said in her second year of chem, she had a professor who came in and said, you know, all that stuff you learned in high school chemistry and some of the stuff you learned in your first year of chemistry, yeah, that's all fairy tales we tell to children until they're ready for the real stuff.
Right. So the thing is so that's Newtonian mechanics. And here's the cool thing. Newtonian mechanics works. It works. If I'm going to try to tell you what angle and velocity I need to hit a baseball to go through the window I'm looking at right now, I'm going to use Newtonian equations, Newtonian mechanics and their equations in order to describe that. If I want to, with poise, velocities, all sorts of things, we can get to the moon almost, maybe, with Newtonian physics. But when it came to certain things like it was basically Maxwell and electromagnetism is when problems started coming up. And so when you get to the scales of the speed of light, Newtonian physics breaks down. It doesn't work anymore. The equations don't apply, paradoxes happen, bad things start getting fuzzy. And that's where Einstein came in. This is why Einstein is famous. We have transitioned from Newtonian mechanics to Einsteinian mechanics. This is the age of general relativity, and that's how we describe. And he had Newton's law of gravity, but then now that's been superseded by general relativity, and so that's where we are now. But I'm not going to use general relativity equations to talk about, what kind of force I'm going to get out of my car moving at 60 miles an hour down a highway if I was to hit a wall or something. It's just you wouldn't use that to describe the physical system there. But when you take general relativity back and you get down to the scales, basically once you get down to a dense enough state, which is the first, I forget, the first Planck second, which is 10 to the negative 23 or maybe even smaller, you get down to the quantum scale. And so once you get to the quantum scale, quantum interactions become very important. They will affect everything in the universe because everything is condensed down to that scale. And general relativity does not apply at that scale. It breaks down. We have singularities, and the thing about singularities when they pop up in science is that we've had them in other theories, and it's a sign that the theory is incomplete, and we've eventually learned more about the theory, and then you find the singularities just kind of disappear. And so we have a great way of describing things in quantum mechanics. There's 4 fundamental forces, at least, that we're aware of, and we can account for 3 of those forces with quantum mechanics. But the one thing we can't do is unify quantum mechanics and gravity. And so that's why there's this big search for quantum gravity. And so the theory is that once we were to find a working theory of quantum gravity, we were able to reconcile what happens before the first Planck second in the Big Bang model, and then we can see what goes on. And so what really happens is that the Big Bang, at least this what we would call the singularity, is not a beginning of the universe, it's simply the end of our understanding of what has happened in the past. At least I think that's a quote I'm stealing from Sean Carroll.
And one of the fascinating things about this is, if we understand it correctly, Newtonian mechanics could still be right in the sense of us still being committed to the mathematics portion of it, but when it comes to the underlying ontology of the universe, that is to say what the universe is like, then we're going to have to look in other places for that, and then we can just kind of add more equations to the equations we know. So would it be better to say that we're more or less committed to the equations we use as opposed to, let's say, the underlying ontology behind the equations?
I mean, you could always do that, right? You can do that for anything. And so this is getting to an area that I have this post I've been boiling on for forever at this point, because I'm trying to learn. Basically, I am of the opinion that we are the question of what the ontology of fundamental reality is going to be a question that we can know in principle. There is no way we can ever have a satisfactory answer to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We can always go, but what if there's one level deeper, right? And it was my studies on the Kalam that kind of led me to eventually kind of come to this position. So, like, one of the things that the Kalam itself predicates itself on is a very specific theory of time, the A theory. And so I have my last video on the Kalam I made only a year ago, I think, was a response to Craig himself. He had a podcast responding to my video series, and I kind of made a long response to him in turn. And so the idea was to say how basically if you look at what science says time is, and about what we would think, it's basically how science says time operates. We would come to the conclusion that the B theory is much more likely than the A theory to be true, based on what we observe. And Craig has this unfalsifiable way of saying, well, it could still be the A theory if the universe worked like this, and there's this undetectable thing if we assume exists, the A theory isn't falsified anymore. And so the trick is you can always do that. And the dirty little secret, of course, is that it's not just theists or Christian apologists who do this. A naturalist can do it just as well, right? So let's say tomorrow quantum mechanics is figured out, and it turns out there is this absolute beginning to the universe, right? There is no time. It is the A theory is true, and time has an absolute beginning at the beginning of the Big Bang. Well, guess what? There are ways for naturalists to say to accommodate that, right? And to think that that is there, and we don't need to infer God. Actually, I shouldn't say because the A theory is true. I should say if we say time had an ultimate beginning. Let's say time is real, but time has an ultimate beginning. We just take a B theory view, right? And that could be just as unfalsifiable in my B theory. I could formulate a way for the B theory to be true, given new evidence that makes the A theory look more true. Right? If you look at the contemporary state of play, if this was a game, you would see the ball is much more on the B theory side right now. But if the ball is to move more to the A theory side of the court, I could still kind of do the same move Craig does and say, it could be this way fundamental ontology-wise, and even if there's a beginning of the universe as a naturalist, I'm fine, right?
Right. One of the interesting things about Craig is that he doesn't always just stick to what science is saying. He always tries to include a lot of a priori kind of thinking. A priori is just a fancy way of saying armchair philosophy. That's just when instead of going around gathering evidence, you go from what you know off the top of your head. Things that are true by definition, or
metaphysical assumptions.
Or metaphysical assumption. The things that you would have to take. Now, one of these things is skeptical scenarios that you could always ask yourself, like, how do I know an evil demon isn't really deceiving me at some point in time, making me think the thoughts I'm thinking? Basic shit like that. Now, some of these scenarios are so skeptical that no rational person is ever expected to answer them, which is fair enough. I mean, we can't always be non-skeptical, but when it comes to certain philosophical positions one might take, that might actually be a little clearer. So one thought experiment Craig uses when discussing time is being a brain in a vat, which is, a very famous thought experiment, once discussed famously by a philosopher known as G.E. Moore. But Craig uses it for a different way. Now, assuming we could be brains in vats, which is possible, as it's not a logical contradiction to say, we could be convinced of a lot of things. We could be convinced that that there's somebody who loves us. We could be convinced of predictions and sociological behavior in other people. There's a lot that we can be convinced of. Just imagine anything from The Matrix. But the passage of time is something which is not something that appears that can emerge, at least from such an experiment, or from such thinking. It doesn't look like anything can be made to look like time isn't passing. Or time is passing. But on the other hand, when it comes to things of the nature of the information we get from physics, that could always just be a result of it. So it seems that a priori, that we're also convinced that we should favor heavily the passage of time as being more real than some of the more fundamental physics aspects. How would you kind of answer those arguments for the A theory of time.
Okay, so glad you brought this one up. And there's two things I'd like to touch on there. One's a tangent, so we'll start with the on point one. So I actually had this in my last video response to Craig. And so he basically says, this was his response to the quantum eternity theorem, which says that either time is infinite into the past or time isn't real, right? It's kind of a dichotomy, and neither one is really good for Craig's views. So Craig responded with this thought experiment saying that I could be a brain in a vat, but I still have my sequence of mental events, therefore the passage of time must be real. And so the idea, and that was criticizing the idea that time is not fundamental, right? So the idea was that either time is, if there's a non-zero energy in the universe, then time must be infinite into the past. Or if the total energy of the universe is zero, time is not real, right? And so therefore, that's how you can kind of say the beginning happens, right? That's the only situation in which time you could say there's a beginning to time, except time isn't really there. And so that's what kind of Craig gravitates to, and says, but time must be real. And so the ontology of your quantum theorem must be wrong. And that's just so. But the idea is that time would be emergent, not fundamental. And to say that, oh, if I'm a brain in a vat and I have my sequence of mental events, therefore the passage of time must be real, well, that in self assumes that mind is fundamental, which is not something a naturalist is going to do. The naturalist is going to say, no, the mind is emergent as well. So is to say that this is somehow to be convincing to a naturalist or an atheist or whatever is just kind of silly. You know, he's baked in another assumption. Whenever you're going to do an a priori metaphysics or any kind of a metaphysical assumption, and I don't think that's anything anybody can ever get away with. Can get away with not doing. You're going to only be able to get as far as what you assume, right? So if you assume the mind is fundamental and therefore the minds exist in time, then therefore I have a sequence of mental events, therefore the passage of time must be real. Except for the fact that if you're to think that a mind is fundamental, then God is a mind, and then there's God's sequence of mental events, therefore time must be fundamental to God. And you're going to kind of come back to that problem I mentioned, I guess, maybe 20 minutes ago.
Both of those are good points, but maybe it could convince some idealistic atheists out there, all three of them.
Yeah.
All right. So now on to a new topic, which is just on the nature of causality. So the nature of causality that Craig has taken up seems to be, and at least in his more public lectures, an Aristotelian notion of efficient and material causation. For those of you who don't know, Aristotle had 4 categories of causes. The 2 that are germane are going to be efficient cause and material cause. Efficient cause, as it was laid there, was kind of the person that acts, or the thing that kind of acts on something, and the material cause is the something which is changed. Formal causes and final causes aren't really as prevalent in Craig's viewpoint, but it's worth discussing anyway, because I really love Aristotle. The formal cause is like the essence of something, which counts it as one member of a universal. So, for example, both me and Counter Apologist are human beings. So are a lot of other people. Yet there are differences among us. So, for example, we have might have different hair colors, might have different hair lengths, might have different skin color, might have different birth origins, parents. Others of us are much more different than us. Some of us having different genders, some of us having different heights, with whatever you want to call it. But there's also something essential that all of us share. Aristotle thought that human beings were all rational and social beings, or animals. That is to say that we're material beings. We crap, poop, eat, or at least that's the end we go towards, but we're rational, and we try to socialize with one another. Those are all necessary for being human. And that's a universal shared amongst all of us. The last one is the final cause, which is just to say there's a purpose or end to which we all exist for. And that's kind of determined by the formal cause. If we're all rational and social animals, then our end goal, or what defines us as being good exemplars of such a thing, is the fact of how we strive for knowledge and truth, and being social and hospitable towards one another. And bad examples of human beings are the ones that purposely try to pervert these ends or functions. In fact, that's kind of the end point of natural law theory. But the two we're going to focus on are the efficient and material causes. But do you think Craig's view is dependent on those, or do you think that he might do well to look at other forms of causality, or has he actually taken up other forms of causality?
So if you actually look at so if you have a definitive debate on the Kalam and the design argument, it's going to be the Craig versus Sean Carroll debate, where, in my opinion, and I think many others, they would say that Carroll did a very fine job of rebutting Craig's arguments. Now, the thing that's interesting there is if you watch it, Sean Carroll was ready to rebut basically this point, and that the idea that he was holding to, at least in the classic formulations, this Aristotelian metaphysics that you're talking about,
right,
and how that has largely been moved on from in terms of the Enlightenment, and we don't really kind of go with that anymore. Craig saw this. He kind of anticipated this move coming, and he thinks it's a good enough objection. He's not an Aristotelian. He basically reformulated the Kalam so as to say that if the universe, anything that begins to exist, has a transcendent cause. Right? Mm-hmm. So he's basically saying causality is a contentious topic. Slot in your version of causality for the word cause. I don't care what it is. He's talking, it says, things that begin to exist must have a transcendent cause. Right? And then that the transcendent is the part that gets you to God. So if you look at the formulation of the argument he used in that debate, that's what he's doing. And I think that he's stuck with that since. So he doesn't, I don't think he needs to use those kind of, he doesn't need to hold to an Aristotelian metaphysic. I think he's used it in the past because what Craig wants to avoid when he brings those up is the idea you can make a Kalam argument against some Christian theology to say that everything we know of everything that begins to exist has a material cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a material cause. And so the conclusion you would draw from that is that something material has always existed, right? Which is completely compatible with theism, including some forms of Christian theism, but it's not compatible with the Orthodox tradition of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing.
Right. In fact, there's at least one council, to my knowledge, in the Catholic tradition, which makes it dogmatic that Christians believe in creation ex nihilo. If you're a Catholic, it's kind of explicitly there in the second book of Maccabees, although it's never mentioned in the Protestant canon of the Bible, which I kind of like to bring up to mess with my Protestant friends. You do realize that the beginning could just be when God starts creating things from primordial matter or something, right?
So Craig actually has in one of his Q&As, if you were to read it, he talks about how one could think of the beginning of the universe. So there was an always existent universe, if you were to be theorist. And so you would say that the universe was creation ex nihilo is to be interpreted as the universe dependent upon God as a sustaining cause. And right. So that's how one would cash out the creation ex nihilo dogma, but he doesn't think it's plausible, and that's why he's obviously an atheist and all that sort of thing. But if he was to set, basically his fallback when he was answering a Christian reader's question was, if you were to find that so compelling, you don't have to give up theism, you could just interpret it in this way, right?
Right. In fact, that's how I interpret it myself. So I'm glad at least Craig allows us to have it. Although it's kind of I'd be more interested in reading Craig's time literature in the future. Okay, but I'm really glad we could get to the causality part. The last one I wanted to touch on was actually the two last things I want to touch on are going to be the first premise and the conclusion. And the first premise is, if anything begins to exist, then it had a cause for its existence, or anything which begins to exist has a cause. On regards to that, could the atheist not accept it? As in, do you think that there are good answers for not accepting the first premise?
Absolutely. I think both premises are false.
Okay.
So one is effectively almost on the technicality. So Craig likes to defend the first premise by saying, if you don't accept it, you think things can just pop into being out of nothing, which is a bit of a false presentation of a view if you reject the premise. So if you were to look at the key phrase begins to exist, it has a very technical and non-intuitive definition that Craig gives. And so it's kind of formulated in such a way that it gives God an explicit out. I don't have all four of the things. He basically says if an entity E begins to exist, if it exists at time t but no other times prior to t, t is the first time that E exists, and there is no state of affairs in the actual world in which entity E does not exist timelessly. That's where he gives God the out from the first premise. And then the fourth bit, which is where I think he runs into the most trouble, is to say that E's existing at t is a tensed fact, which commits one to be committed to the A theory of time. So the simple-sounding premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause, actually means you're committed to this very grand a priori metaphysical view of time must be this way, and so if you don't hold to that, you simply reject the first premise, right?
Right. The interesting thing about this is, you said it yourself in your video, the first two would seem kind of where the intuition would stop. Like, E exists at time t, okay, fair enough, and t is the first time at which E exists. But Craig, I think, has to commit himself to 3 and 4 in order to reconcile himself to the A theory, because if God exists in time, because God is only atemporal, or not in time, without creation, then God exists at time with creation. And t is the first time at which God exists. That's at the very beginning when he enters into time. So God begins to have existence there. But to me, one could technically accept the first two, ditch the number 3 and 4, and just go with a B theory interpretation. Although that kind of commits you to answering other things, like why can't the universe just begin at time t1 and just continue onwards as, just is, without anything sustaining it?
Yeah, so the problem is that so here's the trick, right? You got to be careful. You can be a Christian, hold the B theory of time, hold to the B theory of time, be a Christian, and it's perfectly compatible. You're not engaging in any kind of a contradiction in your set of beliefs. What you lose, however, is the ability to argue the fact that God must exist, and that's what the Kalam is trying to do. And so Craig doesn't want to leave, he's trying not to leave any room. He doesn't want to leave room for a naturalist or an atheist to be able to say that the universe could just exist. And this is one of the things that really got me, I guess, motivated to even get into the counter-apologetic game, which is to say, no, you can't do this, right? There's, your first sign of trouble when you're looking at this argument, especially the way Craig, and I like to call it, if you'll forgive my cursing, the standard Biola bullshit. The people who go to Biola University, which basically is, do you like William Lane Craig's apologetics? That's his brand, and you'll see apologists like Frank Turek, Dinesh D'Souza, and a whole bunch of other people who really aren't philosophers peddling the same kinds of arguments, and they will basically present it in such a way that says, see, science proves God must exist. Atheists are irrational. They're denying science or whatever.
Right.
And it's a bunch of crap. Mm-hmm. Because your first sign that this should be a bunch of crap is to say, well, if you go to a bunch of physics conferences or cosmology conferences, you're going to find the majority of people are atheists. Yeah, so you're going to say, so wait a minute, you mean these people who are all quoting, who are all atheists, are denying that God exists? Like, it doesn't prove that the argument is wrong, but it should tell you that something fishy is going on, right? These people are not stupid, Stephen Hawking is not a moron, right? So, so that's kind of the goal of what Craig's brand of apologetics is there to do. He doesn't want there to be an out for an atheist. And so that's why he's holding the argument in this kind of a formulation. Now, in reality, there's a plethora of interpretations on time and what that one can do. One could be an atheist, and you could use something like the quantum eternity theorem, and or things like a priori everything has a material cause, to think that something that material has always existed for an infinite amount of time. One can be a B theorist and say the universe began to exist, but the first moment is like the beginning, the leading edge of a ruler, right? So the ruler always exists, but it does have a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could just say time is emergent, not fundamental, and there's just this quantum stuff that always exists, and that's it. And both naturalism and theism can perfectly cohere with any one of those interpretations. But you're not going to get this level of nuance and an explanation out of Craig because he wants to be able to argue people to believe in a God. That's his job, or at least that's what he tries to. That's what he publicly sells as his job. If you were to read some of his literature written for other Christians, he admits that what he's trying to do is give Christians a reason to believe, and so that doesn't. He just wants them to be able to rationally defend their faith, and so it's not necessarily something that's going to be perfectly coercive or perfectly validly deductive that you can't escape, but it basically means that they don't look like they're engaging in fideism, or however you pronounce it. They just believe without evidence. They could say, well, if I take these assumptions about a theory of time and look at the evidence of the Big Bang, and I look at it in just this sort of way, I can say it's quote unquote evidence for God's existence.
Although, to stand up to Biola for 1 second, one of my friends just did come out of there. He didn't graduate, but that's where he learned all he knew, and he did actually be something of a rebel. He's a presuppositionalist, and being a presuppositionalist at Biola was being like a fish out of water for him, because him and only one other person there held to this viewpoint. It was very kind of antithetical to what was being taught there.
You'll find actually there's quite a lot of similarities between the Plantinga's Reformed epistemology and the presuppositionalist approach.
Right.
And Biola will hold to Plantinga's Reformed epistemology.
What I gather between the difference of the presuppositional and Reformed epistemology is this: whereas Reformed epistemology holds that we have kind of either something like the revelation of the Holy Spirit, or something akin to what was it Plantinga called it?
Sensus Divinitatis?
Sensus Divinitatis, thank you. Either one gives us kind of sufficient reason already to believe in God. However, that just makes it properly basic. It still leaves open room for a defeater. So somebody could, in theory, give a firm defeater against the existence of God, but it just means that both the atheist and the theist are technically on the same level. Whereas for the revelational epistemologists, such as Bonson and my friend, as he described it, God's revelation is perfectly sufficient for something to be rational, and something which is counter to that is de facto irrational. So there's a bit of a difference. At least Plantinga's Reformed epistemology, or Craig's Reformed epistemology, however way you cut it, still gives you kind of a room for, okay, we're both on rational grounds. I'll give my argument, you can give yours. Whereas for the precept, burden of proof is on you now. Prove that God doesn't exist, because on my worldview, you're just irrational right now. Because God is the very grounds of reason and logic and all that transcendental goodness. So I just want to cut the difference right there. And the last thing I want to touch on is the conclusion of the Kalam argument. Craig has a conclusion formulated, which is the universe must have a cause, but for that cause to be God, the only two things that could cause the universe are minds and numbers. It can't really be numbers because, well, numbers aren't causally efficacious. Therefore, it must be a mind. Are you convinced by this form of deduction, or do you think that it's still problematic?
Yeah. So he basically tries to rule out that there can't be something physical behind the creation of the universe. And I think that's just a bunch of baloney. I think science, if you were to say, look, if this was a game and you were to look at the state of play of the ball, it would be far more on the sign of something material always existing rather than not. But yeah, I mean, if you follow Craig, if you take all of his assumptions in, well, then yeah, okay, right? There's going to be some kind of a however you call it, you'll kind of get to his conclusion, right? I mean, the trick is in rejecting the premises leading up to it. But I mean, this just kind of begs the question of like, how can a mind interact with the physical, right? I mean, the dualist interaction problem, which I personally find to be fairly fatal to dualism. But you say, well, then how does God affect the universe, right? And so it becomes, well, he just does. It does so in a fundamental way, right? And that's kind of it. At least so it seems to me, for how they can try to cash out that view. And it just doesn't really seem very, it just seems to be kind of saying, well, that's it, and that's where I cash out my end, and I'm good from there. I can't see how that's possibly convincing to someone who doesn't already predisposed to that view.
Are you familiar with Bill Valacina? I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
I am not.
He has a blog called Maverick Philosopher, and he actually defends substance dualism. And his response to the problem of interaction, and it might actually work here, is he takes what's known as a counterfactual notion of causality, which means, I have it right in front of me, E causes F equals, by definition, if E has occurred, F would not have occurred. Oh, sorry. If E has not occurred, then F would not have occurred. So if the event would not have occurred, then the effect itself would not have occurred as well. So on that kind of view, it doesn't really require kind of interaction in the sense of force being exerted onto something which doesn't itself take up force, and vice versa. It's just kind of like a very loose sense of causality. So
in that case, you could then say, so one, I think that's extraordinarily esoteric and a bit non-standard, at least in contemporary philosophy, in terms of acceptance of a counterfactual account of causality. But notwithstanding, if one was to take that view, then all the atheist would then have to do is to say that there are some laws of nature that exist timelessly or whatever, and that then created the universe in this counterfactual causal way, right? Or there was some Platonic object or some Platonic form that caused this in some kind of a way, right? You would think of the laws of nature in some kind of a Platonic form. And then say, why can't I just think of it that way? If you were to embrace this kind of a thing.
Right, and this is kind of why I think the Kalam might be better off as a probabilistic argument, because you couldn't technically rule out all these other potential causes, given how expansive a definition of causality might be to allow God to interact with the universe, or something immaterial to interact with the universe. Thus, it seems to me perfectly reasonable that it could be better off as a probabilistic argument, because if there is a universe beginning to exist, it kind of makes God a little more probable, since on a universe coming into being through a sustaining cause, something outside of time via some counterfactuality, then it would seem at first glance that it narrows down the candidates to include God, as opposed to the universe itself just being a series of causes and effects.
Well, I don't know how in the world you're going to place probabilities on that, or at least on assumptions, and that I can't just as equally make some kind of an assumption about, like I said, I guess like a law of nature or some kind of a non-mind thing that would cause it in the same kind of a way. And I also think that you face the evidence that we do have from things like quantum mechanics about how something material very likely has always existed. Or something along the lines of where you would say there's the loop quantum gravity model, which basically says that the universe went through a cycle of expanding and contracting, and time is actually infinite. So, I mean, the Agrare-Groton model, I'm going to mispronounce it terribly, but it's a very well-defined model of the universe that basically shows that time did not have a beginning, that some world lines do go past through the Big Bang and come out the other side. And it's kind of like an oscillating universe model. And
Right.
if you were to look at the Craig debate, they had lectures on the second day that weren't as widely watched, and Craig had one of his associates, James Sinclair, and Carroll pressed Sinclair on the point about, what about this model? And Sinclair, at the very end of the talk, said, I do have to concede that, yes, there's nothing inconsistent with this model. It is well defined that would say that, yes, these time-like geodesics do go infinitely into the past.
All right, and with that positive note to Sean Carroll, I'm going to end this very vivid and very enlightening discussion. Counter-Apologists, thank you so much for dropping in. This has been a great interview and a fantastic one-on-one. Really appreciate it. You have closing word.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was definitely a lot of fun. I just hope if anybody's watching this and you think I'm wrong or something, I invite you to take a look at my blog and my YouTube channel. And don't just read my stuff. I have a lot of references in there to kind of talk about where I get this from. Do the research yourself. Take a look at what is actually said in modern cosmology about this.